Ladies and gentlemen, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated on November 13, 1982, quickly evolved from a controversial sculpture to one of the nation's most cherished emblems of service, sacrifice, and national reflection. Individuals involved in the fundraising, design, and dedication of the wall will discuss their journey, their key decisions, and the memorial's lasting legacy. Please welcome to the Rally Point tent the discussion panel on Reflections on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial.
Thank you, Chuck. My name is Mark Henderson, and I'm a former naval flight officer and the historian for the Vietnam War Commemoration. I'm honored to be the moderator for today's panel, Reflections on Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Please allow me a few minutes to introduce our panel of distinguished visitors. Mr. Jan Scruggs conceived the Vietnam Veterans Memorial as a tribute to those who served in the Vietnam War, and he's directly responsible for making the wall a reality. Mr. Scruggs enlisted in the U.S. Army after high school, and he served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 199th Infantry Brigade, where he was wounded and decorated for valor. He returned from the war with PTSD and became an expert on the impact of psychological trauma to combat veterans, publishing academic articles, testifying before Congress on the subject. Mr. Scruggs is the co-founder of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. In 1979, he began the effort to build the now famous memorial. The wall was dedicated in 1982. He credits the considerable help he received from veterans, and he attests a talented team can do great things. A native son of Maryland, Mr. Scruggs joins us today from semi-retirement in Annapolis. Mr. Terrence O'Donnell is a senior counsel at the Washington, D.C. law firm Williams & Conley, LLP, where he was partner for most of his professional career. He served as an Air Force counterintelligence officer in Vietnam from March 1969 to March 1970, and as outside counsel for Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund that built the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Mr. O'Donnell graduated from the United States Air Force Academy in 1966 and Georgetown Law School in 1971. He served on the White House staff 1972 to 74 for President Nixon and 1974 to 77 as personal assistant to President Ford. He was appointed by President Reagan 2 terms in the Air Force Academy Board of Visitors, and he chaired that board for 2 years. He was confirmed by the Senate as General Counsel of the Department of Defense in 1989, and he served in that capacity under Secretary Cheney until March 1992. He was Executive Vice President of Textron Incorporated for 12 years beginning in 2000. He's been elected to the boards of 2 public companies and many nonprofit organizations, including currently the Air Force Academy Foundation and the Gerald R. Ford Foundation. Mr. O'Donnell was awarded the Bronze Star for his service in Vietnam and the Department of Defense Distinguished Service Award for his work as General Counsel. Mr. Paul Spryragan is a Washington-based architect, planner, and author. He's a native of Boston, a graduate of MIT, and was a Fulbright Scholar in Italy. He's worked in Italy and Sweden, in many parts of the United States. He's also taught and lectured in many schools of architecture, planning, and landscape architecture throughout the country and abroad. For 12 years, he broadcast a weekly program on design for National Public Radio. He was the director of urban design programs for the American Institute of Architects and the first director of design and planning for the National Endowment for the Arts. He's also conducted several architectural design competitions, most notably that competition for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He's the author, editor, or contributor to 12 books on architecture and urban design. He served 2 years as an officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we'll begin our panel panel discussion by addressing the conceptual origins of the wall, and then we'll dive into how the vision for the National Memorial became a reality. So I'll first ask, what inspired the creation and establishment of a national memorial to the veterans of the Vietnam War, and what was its purpose?
Hello, my name is Jan Scruggs. I'm the person who in 1979 decided there ought to be a National Vietnam Veterans Memorial engraved with the names of the casualties from that war, and started the effort not knowing what I was doing. Ultimately, I got a good team behind me, and including Terry O'Donnell and Paul Spryregan, who oversaw and helped us engineer the largest architectural design competition held in the history of Western civilization at that time. Fantastic result. The winning design was from a young, who can tell me the name of the winning designer? Maya Lin, yes, from Athens, Ohio. And she had a very striking design that we used the black granite, in which you can see your own reflection in the black granite, and would keep it low to the earth, very horizontal instead of vertical, so as not to overpower the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial. So fantastic idea, fantastic group of people. We had a lot of controversy, and I'll let Paul take it from here because he's the expert in design competition. It's very fascinating.
What's the question you want to respond to, Mark?
So we were talking about the creation and establishment of the memorial and its purpose. So why did you decide to have a design competition for the memorial, and how was it conducted?
Well, the decision to have a design competition was made by the sponsor group, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Design competitions for architectural projects, planning, and landscape are as old as human history, and there's a great record of their accomplishments. In Washington, D.C., the Capitol Building, the Washington Monument, to a lesser extent, the Lincoln Memorial, the Library of Congress, the Pan American Union is a really long list. The reason for holding design competition for this memorial was quite simple, and that is that it was for Americans to answer, to find, to search for a way to honor the memory of those whose lives were lost, and by implication, all those who served, all those who were wounded and all those who were served. The way the competition was conducted, it took a period of about 9 months from the time we started to the time we had the design. It's a rather exacting process in which we first announced the competition to the public. We received inquiries about it. We sent those who registered to do the competition, sent in registration cards. We sent them full information about the site, about what the competition was for. It was finally judged by a panel of 8 eminent American designers, many of whom, most of whom I believe, had been veterans themselves. And the result was presented to the sponsor group and enthusiastically accepted.
And how did they choose the winning design?
Well, there were, as Jan just mentioned, it was the largest open design competition ever held until that point. It was surpassed by the World Trade Center competition. The display of the submissions, each designer or designer group could submit 2 panels, 30 inches wide, 40 inches high, and altogether they amounted to a linear mile and a third of display. If you walked by it slowly, glancing at each design without stopping, it would take you 3.5 hours. That's one of the many reasons we had a really expert panel. They could look at something and see in an instant whether or not it had any possibility to be the memorial. It took about a week to do it, actually about 4.5 days before they came to their decision.
Did they base their decision on specific criteria outlined?
The criteria were quite simple, and the single most important one was Jan's idea, and that was that the names of the approximately 58,000 Americans who had died, including 8 nurses, be presented on the wall. And that memorial does it, and it does it without any ambiguity and without any distraction, except that it is in a place of enormous honor, and that is its view of the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. In fact, during the jury deliberation process, one of the jurors remarked, "You know, a lot of the memorial is already there. It's the setting." I don't think there's another place, another site where it could have been located that could give it greater honor.
So before we move on to the realization and construction of the memorial, I just want to ask you, is there anything else you want to add about bringing the memorial to the design process, to the stage where you had the competition and chose a memorial or chose a design?
I'm not sure I understand.
Do you want to add anything before we move on to
Well,
construction?
having the design was just having the design in hand and approved by the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, the sponsor, was just step one. We had to get it approved by the 3 major federal agencies, the National Park Service, the National Capital Planning Commission, and the Commission of Fine Arts. I've been in Washington a while. I knew how those agencies worked. I have great respect for them. We worked with them from the beginning, and we procured their approval step by step. Simultaneously, the VVMF mobilized to get an architect and engineer who could develop the design, as well as a contractor, a builder, the Gilbane Building Company, that also built the Air Space Museum. So no time was wasted getting the approvals and mobilizing to build.
Getting through the agencies and getting the memorial approved is a very, very difficult process. And if the memorial design was not brilliant, it would have never been approved. And the major veterans organizations would never have supported it, but they did. And something most people don't focus on is that there were no federal funds available to build the memorial. So Jan had to put together a team and go out and raise the money to build the memorial purely on private funds. And we'll come to it in a moment, but when it was completed, it was then conveyed to the government and the Department of Interior Park Service. But we think that these memorials necessarily are done by the government. They're not. It was the veterans and their supporters who contributed many, many hundreds of thousands of small contributions to raise the necessary funds. And that just shows how important it was to the veterans community.
Thank you, gentlemen. Oh, did you want to add anything in?
I would just point out there are a half a dozen, as many as 20 half-scale replicas of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that travel the country. So, you know, imitation is flattery, is imitation, whatever. But it's a great tribute to Maya Ying-lin that people want to see this memorial in their own hometowns. So, a really fantastic work of art. And the thing that makes it different than all other memorials, that people interact with it, they touch it, they kiss it, they cry on it. And where it's at right now, there's kind of a communion between the living and the dead, and it's done so much for military veterans and for the people who come to see it, average tourists. But thank you all very much.
It's also a very personal memorial. You not only touch it, it's made out of polished black granite, which was a big criticism when the design was first presented. But all of you, I'm sure, have stood in front of it, and what you notice, what you experienced was you look at a name, but you see yourself reflected, and you see the trees in the sky reflected. So three things come together: the name of the soldiers being honored, yourself there, and the world around you. It's most unusual. I don't know any other memorial that does that.
Yeah, and following up on Jan's remark about how it inspired memorials all over the country, including replicas, just lest we think it's forgotten, the war and the veterans, just 6 weeks ago in California at the President Nixon Library, they dedicated a Vietnam memorial, a Vietnam monument, which they attributed to the Vietnam Memorial here in Washington. So thank God the recognition of our veterans continues even today, although we are getting long in the tooth, Jan.
So, gentlemen, millions of Americans visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial every year. In fact, year after year, it remains the most visited memorial on the National Mall. Despite the memorial's enduring popularity, many of Americans are unaware of the considerable difficulty that proponents of the memorial faced in order to bring it to fruition. Now, you mentioned a few already, but if you could elaborate just a bit on some of the additional challenges that your efforts encountered, and the challenges throughout the realization and construction of the memorial, and please describe what was so controversial specifically about the memorial design and who opposed it.
The opponents have some very good way to tell people how they feel about it. They said, every memorial in Washington is white, but this one is black. Therefore, you are criticizing the Vietnam War, and we will not allow this to be built. They were pretty serious, and these are people who were respected political leaders, some in Congress, some in the U.S. Senate, and others as well. So the memorial itself, this material, allows you to have this personal experience with it. And because of the success of that memorial, every state in the United States has at least one Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So California's got 3 or 4. There's a nice one in Vermont. I mean, they are everywhere. So we've done a lot for the granite industry, but and because of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, now there's a memorial ongoing. It's being built now to the veterans of Desert Storm, and yet another one is going to get a site very soon, Global War on Terror Memorial. And I actually began the effort for that in 2015 in the hope that someone would pay attention. And we got some West Point graduates who have taken that by the reins, and it will be built. They need $100 million or more. So it's not easy to raise that kind of money. There's a lot of priorities, there's a lot of competition. But they got their hands full, but at least they've got a good start.
Every memorial in Washington has been quote-unquote controversial. Controversy in our society is a way of talking about things. Sometimes it gets pretty rough, and it was pretty rough with the Vietnam Memorial. But think of this. It took 50 years to get the Washington Monument completed after it was first proposed in a competition. It took 70 years to get the Lincoln Memorial. It was dedicated in 1922. Plenty of controversy about that. It's a form of deliberation. Unfortunately, in the case of the Vietnam Memorial, it really got pretty nasty. But Jan and his fellow board members and members of the VVMF stood tall and got it done. By the way, it was just from the time we had the design to the time it was dedicated was 29 months.
Yeah, we had some very bizarre things, including some real actual racism there regarding Maya Lin's design. I personally thought it was fantastic, the fact that we had an Asian American designing this memorial. But some people are had a different way of looking at things. But the arrangement of the names, they're actually alphabetized by day. And the beginning and the end of the center meet, like yin and yang in China and Japan. So they meet, and it's just a fantastic work of art. And I believe they've calculated 5 million people a year for the past 10 years. So it's probably been 75 or 100 million people have come to see it. And I'm a guide there from time to time. And tour groups come from Spain and Italy. They want to see the Vietnam Veterans Memorial because it's such a great work of architecture.
Yeah, I think the following up on Jan and Paul, the opponents of the memorial, in my view, did not have bad intentions. They simply thought that it did not properly honor those who served and the war. The memorial in Jan's design, his concept, including all the names, was brilliant. And it honors those who served and those who died in combat or related to the war. And anything really worthwhile in life, you have to work for, and you're going to have some hurdles. And we had those. Allegations of misconduct, of financial irregularity, of self-dealing leaked to the media and so forth. We had to deal with all those. Ultimately, we had a GAO audit which came in and looked at every piece of paper and cleared the VVMF as a well-run, financially responsible outfit. But going back to the theme of opposition, the important thing is the federal agencies, the veterans organizations who funded so much of the memorial were behind it, and with that support, nothing was going to stop this project. We didn't have that support, project would have never gotten off the ground.
Let me point out that if the opposition to the design had prevailed, if the original design, the Mylan design, had been rejected and something else would have come, another design would have been done, that design would very likely have had some reference or implication, suggestion to heroism, to things, to battle or glory, to things related to war. If that had happened, I ask you to recall the protests that occurred against the Vietnam War before the war was over. If that kind of memorial had been proposed, it would have, the objection to it would have been enormous. There would be no Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I think it was Jan's brilliance, really, to insist that the memorial be no political statement either way. It was for those who had died and served.
Well, thank you very much. And reflective and contemplative were the two words that we had the people on the jury keep in mind as they put their design. And the idea of the names came from a guy named Carl Jung. Carl Jung studied with and under Sigmund Freud, the great psychiatrist from Germany, and he was Austrian. But he had the idea that every society has role models, and that warriors were a very important role model, an archetype, a societal archetype. And they would, so therefore the names of this would be easier to sell it to the public, taking the Vietnam War out of the equation. And that's exactly what we did, and it worked exactly how I'd planned. And I'm really not that good, straight C student, nothing in particular, but I knew what I was doing. I knew this had to be done, and I knew the names would be crucial. And it was not only crucial, but it didn't become the primary element for the memorial. And everybody says, oh, it's a great memorial for the people who gave their lives in Vietnam. But in fact itself, you should read what the inscription says. It's to the men and women of the armed forces of the United States who served in the Vietnam War. Okay.
Now, Jan, you mentioned, or I mentioned in your introduction, a statement from you that a talented team can do great things. And with that, I'll ask the panel, what individuals and organizations proved critical to developing and building the design and bringing the memorial to fruition?
Well, the Veterans of Veterans of Foreign Wars gave us about $1 million. The American Legion gave us about $1 million. We got a lot of small contributions, but it was the political support of these organizations was more important than the financial support, because I figured out I could raise money for this easily enough. But selling this to keeping it alive while we fought the political battles, that's what we really needed the American Legion and VFW for. And at the time Reagan was president, I would write memorandums to Ed Meese, and I would give it to the VFW. They would get it to him. So I was working in the inside angle, and that's the way I do things. That's the way we did things in Washington. I'm retired. I'm done. And enjoying it.
Well, they say success has 1,000 authors, and in this case, it couldn't be more true. From the time we started, Americans really wanted to forget about the war. The veterans couldn't. And when the project started and we reached out for help from in many directions, we got nothing but great cooperation from the local military, the 3 approval agencies, really everyone. I would put on top of the list, or it was one of the many important contributors was the Commission of Fine Arts, because as they approved the memorial in its initial preliminary conceptual stage until their final approval on the fine details, their approval had the force of law. What they approved became law. It had to be that way. So that is one of many parts of this story. Another one was I'm sitting between 2 of the people who were among those thousands, and it reminded me of a remark that Albert Einstein made. The most important thing to do when you get a great idea is what you do next. That was Jan.
Well, one final story for me is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was actually not going to be built. It was now March of 1982. We had gotten everything through the commissions. Everything was ready. We had the money in hand. We were going to transfer it to the Secretary of the Interior. I sent one of my employees and a White House fellow to get the construction permit, and he said, "Sorry, tell Mr. Scruggs that there will be no construction permit issued." Why? Because Secretary of the Interior has received over 20 phone calls from powerful members of Congress demanding that this project be stopped. And this was in the hands of a guy named Tom Shull, some 31-year-old kid, West Point graduate, and got an MBA from Harvard too. But he's working for James Baker and a guy named Bob McFarland. So he looked the Secretary of the Interior's Vice President in the eye and he says, "Actually, you're wrong. We're going to get the construction permit today, and you're going to give it to me. I'm here talking on behalf of the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. He wants this fixed, and we want you to do it." So that's all it took. He gave me the construction permit. However, he was over playing his hand a little bit there. But we had to get it, and without that, there'd be no memorial. This thing would have just flown away. So, Tom Shull's his name, by the way. He's now the chairman of the board of a company called AFES, Armed Forces Employment or Services. Thank you.
Along those lines, Jan walked up and down the halls of Congress and the Senate trying to get support early on, talking to anybody he could talk to, and that personal appeal really worked well. And out of that came some really strong supporters. Senator John Warner, who described himself as a foot soldier in Jan's army, the former senator from Virginia, and Charles Mathias from Maryland in particular, but there were a whole host of other members of Congress that Jan recruited. And at first they would say, wait a minute, Vietnam was controversial. Of course, everything is controversial. And you're jumping ahead of certain other wars and goals for the mall, which is the precious land that we're on in this vicinity, you can't jump ahead and get it done. And by God, he did. And it was remarkable. So, Jan, I salute you for that.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to move on to a discussing the wall and war memory. Before we open the floor to questions, we'll address some of the legacies of the wall and its impact on American memory of the Vietnam War. This is an immense topic, so I'm going to target my questions with focus. So the first question is regarding the memorial's significance to Vietnam War veterans. The Vietnam War Commemoration has conducted more than 840 oral history interviews with veterans, and one of the final questions is about the memorial. A trend among many veterans that we've interviewed is that many were initially critical of the memorial's design. However, once they visited the memorial, their views changed, and often dramatically. What is it about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that has such a profound effect upon the Vietnam War veterans?
Well, the basic problem is looking at artists and artists' conception of what the Vietnam Veterans Memorial would look like didn't work because not many people could look at something like that and transform it into two-dimensional. So that was working against us. So I don't know, Terry, what do you think? But when I look at the impact of it, everything kind of comes back to the names on the memorial, the pilgrimage that people take to put the names, put flowers next to the names, of messages. It's really quite a fantastic operation. Go ahead, Terry.
One of the remarks that was made during the jury deliberations during that week when they were reviewing all the designs was, many people won't understand this memorial until they experience it firsthand. There's one quality of a great work of art, which is that it doesn't tell you what to think, it makes you think. Think about the Washington Monument. What does that make you think about? That's what you bring to it. I think in the case of the Vietnam Memorial, people bring their life experiences to it, and it touches them in many different ways. But the evidence that 5 million people visited, is that the number of 5 million a year?
Annually, that's correct.
You know, that single fact, I think, confirms those views.
Yeah, I think one definition of a great memorial is that it conveys a forceful message about the events or the individuals that it commemorates. And I think, Paul, in every respect, the design that your panel chose meets that criteria enormously and successfully meets that criteria. And that's why it is so compelling to visitors, veterans, families, those who served, those who didn't serve. They want to see this, and they're moved by it. You go down there, and it is a religious experience. And one of the reasons it is that the Vietnam Memorial Fund, which Jan created and exists today, goes in and pays the difference, the margin of excellence, because the Park Service, who cares for it, is limited in their budget. And they frankly don't have enough money to do everything they would like. So the VVMF, which Jan started this tradition and continues today, goes in and makes the extra. You know, the panels could crack. We have panels stored at a military installation. Plans to replace, keeping the memorial in honor of the veterans pristine and free of any kind of trash, having volunteers there who can help a citizen find the the name they're looking for, someone in their town or someone in their family. Those extras really make the memorial a very, very special place.
Let me add one thing. In the final deliberations, the final decision of the panel, they looked at maybe 15 designs that had survived the review. And the one they designated third place, the remark they made about that was, this is the kind of memorial would make if it were for World War I. The second place design, they remarked, this is the kind of memorial would make if it were for World War II. And then they came to the one they chose and recommended, this is the memorial of our time. This is how we speak. This is in the language of our time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Transitioning now from the Vietnam veterans community to the wider public, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is the widest visited memorial on the National Mall. Why do you think that is, and what distinguishes the wall from other iconic American memorials on the National Mall?
I'd note that there's a lot more than just the design of the big V for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. There's also the three servicemen statue, great work of art by a great American sculptor, probably the best American sculptor of the 20th century, Frederick Hart is his name. And so those are two factors. And we'll think of more, but basically it draws people there, they feel comfortable there. It almost puts many people in a trance. They're so overcome by emotion, or even noisy groups of high school kids, you bring them there, they're very reverent. So it's quite an extraordinary thing. Also, the women's statue at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, absolutely fantastic, a great sculptor, and it's used with some frequency. It's a very nice place to give lectures to small groups of people because it's very private.
Not far from here, a few minutes' walk, is the Holocaust Memorial Museum. Inside is an inscription and a quote from Elie Wiesel, which is, this museum is not really an answer, it's a question. And I think the same can be said of the Vietnam Memorial. It's not an answer, it raises questions. It raises questions about the resources and power of our great, great country and how it should be used. I think the Vietnam Veterans Memorial really poses that as a great question, something that occurred in the lifetimes of many of those who are sitting right here. It's a question we'll be probing forever.
So my final question for you gentlemen is about the influence that the wall has had on American memory about the war itself more broadly. So how has this influence extended to other war memorials and commemorations?
In the first sense, it's extended because once this was built and became so popular, all of a sudden they decided to have a World War I memorial here in Washington, D.C., which will be done 100 years after the end of World War I. But, you know, it's kind of a copycat thing. And then the veterans of World War II, well, we need one too, and they put one up. It's very nice. I think it cost about $120 million. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the construction costs were $4 million for the entire memorial. Absolutely extraordinary. So it's had an impact by replication. And Cody, Wyoming, recently, I got an email from Cody, Wyoming, and here the big black granite, you know, name with all the names of the guys from beautiful Wyoming who gave their lives in Vietnam.
We tend to think of memorials related to war as being heroic and glorifying war and glorifying battle. In fact, there are a number of very important ones that don't do that do what the Vietnam Veterans Memorial does, and that is make you think. There's one in France that was built by the British for, I think it was 70,000 British soldiers. How much was it? It's in a place called Thiepval towards Belgium. And it honors the memory of something like 70,000 British soldiers whose bodies were never recovered. They were blown to bits or buried in mud. Right here on the mall, at the end of the mall at the foot of the Capitol, is a memorial to Ulysses S. Grant. A lot of people don't see it because it's really not on the pedestrian path, but I urge you to go down and see it. It is anything but a heroic gesture. It is a question.
Yeah, just following up on that, I think what Paul and Jan alluded to earlier is the most compelling feature of the memorial. You cannot walk down that path and see the gradual increase in the number of names and not think about the nature of war and the investment of life and treasure. And when you look into it and see yourself with the name and a national monument or another memorial behind you, it is an incomparable effect. And it means so much to people. People take away their own views, their own perspective on what they just saw, but they take away a memory that's going to stick with them for life.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'd like to open the panel up to questions from the audience at this time. So to facilitate that, if you have a question, I'll come out and hand you the microphone. Please limit yourself to one question. We do have just 10 to 15 short minutes remaining on the panel. So if you'd like to ask the panel a question, raise your hand and I'll come out to you. All right, I see one in the back, so I'll go there first.
Gotcha. Where's the question?
This is not really a question. This is what the moving wall meant to me back in, when we went to Santa Rosa, California. And you were there, Jan. And it was an extremely healing time for me. That's all I have to say.
Any other questions? Thank you for your comment, ma'am. Thank you. And, the question was, it was actually a comment about visiting the wall and it being a very healing time for her. So it was a comment rather than a question. But are there anyone in the audience with questions?
Oh, I will say, I don't know whether you out there know this, but I had considerable post-traumatic stress disorder when I returned from Vietnam. It's certainly gotten a little better, I suppose. But and I became an authority on PTSD at American University, wrote academic papers, and testified in front of Congress. So in one sense, it was my own post-traumatic stress disorder that I'm trying to heal. I'm trying to get the wall to heal it, and that's just kind of part of the story.
Hey, gentlemen, I don't have a question, but I want to thank you very much for coming out here. Jan, to hear the story about how you made your vision a reality and the diligence and the hard work that it took, and the fact that I think you made the comment about it being a religious experience, exactly what I was thinking. It's a pilgrimage for the Vietnam veterans and their families that come down here. So thank you, gentlemen, for all you do, and for all you do to support us, and the partnership will continue. So thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our discussion panel on reflections on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Please join me in thanking the panel members for an informative and engaging discussion.